Hello, welcome to Viccylove Studios, I guess. And I'm Vic. I want to show you guys today how I hide seams and how I debulk certain seams. This means that I either trim off some excess, or stitch, or iron, or use a couple of other techniques I've learned over time. How I debulk or make my seams a little bit less bulky, showy, or easier to handle. One thing you can do that always helps is having less seam allowance. However, everyone is not going to be comfortable with the amount of seam allowance that someone who's experienced can use. Everyone can't use just a couple of millimeters as a seam allowance, and some fabrics will not allow that kind of seam allowance. Another thing is the fact of thickness. This is a very thick fabric, which is actually not really good if you want to make doll clothing because of how thick it is. It creates a lot of bulk, but you can get some really cute and chunky kind of clothing that works very well for like cold weather, or if you just want to look more comfortable. However, there will be a lot of bulk. As you can see here, there is quite a bit of extra fabric on the inside of the sleeve that I'm not gonna trim away, and I'm not gonna stitch it in place because that's more work than it's worth for something that's not gonna be visible most of the time. Making as tiny of stitching and as tiny of results as you can. It's quite hard to get too close to the edge without messing it up. Even I mess up a lot when I make things too close to the edge. And some of these are not the best seams, but they are as good as I'm willing to get them. Partially because of how much time it actually takes to make a garment, and because of the price class I make clothing in. I don't make high-end doll clothing, I make more of everyday wear, and the kind of clothing that you can actually just like spontaneously buy some of for your doll. I don't strive to be a high-end brand, I more strive for being the kind of brand you go to on a regular basis, rather than I'm gonna buy one outfit from this maker and then I'm gonna be poor for the year. I'd rather be the kind of person you go to and be like, oh yes, okay, I'm gonna buy a blind bag and 3 sets of pants. That's the kind of comparison I have to make every time I make clothing. So, with that in mind, some seams don't really need much of a debulking process. Like hemming, for example, I use zigzag or straight stitch, and I try to use as little bit of the fabric as I can in order to save up on the amount of fabric I use and lessen the amount of scraps made and all of those kind of things. But also because then I don't have to trim as much. Some parts that might need trimming is corners like these, where it gets a little bit too much overlap from the seam, while in the middle of this seam area it's pretty flat. And you can see here, even though it's like so many layers at the same spot, it's not gonna be too much if you just trim a little bit of a corner. There's also the inner sleeves. These you will most likely need to trim. In my case, I haven't trimmed this shirt. I'm gonna try to trim a little bit of it without hurting the shirt. But when it's this tiny and in these areas, it's a lot easier to trim when you haven't sewn the whole shirt together and just wait to sew on buttons, because it's a lot harder to cut round items than flat. With that said, we also have really thin fabrics like this one. It's a very thin jersey, and it's one of the most... It's hard to work with, but the results are very good, and it's a lot less of bulk in all of the items when you use a thinner jersey. We have a kind of jersey fabric for these, and there's quite a bit of non-trimmed bulk that's in the arms and in other areas. Because of the thin nature of this fabric, it doesn't really affect that much of the result. This, for example, I can trim or just try and iron down and it'll just lay flat. And it won't affect how the hood looks at all. But when you do trim, always make sure there's a little bit of fabric left still, because if you trim way too close to the thread, you are going to get a ripped seam very soon, and that's sad, and nobody wants that. We have the technique of top stitching or overstitching or understitching. Depends on who you ask what it's called, but I think it's top stitching, at least from what I've learned. And that's when you end up with this kind of double seam. You first stitch the pieces together, easy peasy as usual. You attach one part to the other. This works very well for collars and for pants, simply because this kind of extra seam on a pair of pants looks natural. It looks like it should be there. And the nifty thing I've done is I fold the whole seam allowance to the side, not to both sides, but to one. You can do it to both sides if you want to, but that's a lot more extra work. I just fold it to one side, the side I want the additional seam to be. In this case, I want them to be towards the front of the pants. And I just stitch a straight stitch all the way along the additional seam, so it doesn't fold up at all. And it doesn't sound like this should be reducing bulk, but it really gives a lot smoother finish, and it makes the pants look a little bit more professional, as well as hiding the bulk. It doesn't fully remove the bulk, but it hides it. A lot of the bulk you get with certain clothing you can't really avoid, especially if you use a thick kind of terry jersey fabric like this, or if you use a really modern jersey like this. Like, it's thinner than my t-shirt. That's how thin this is. But that also makes this hard to work with, because the sewing machine is gonna eat it, and if you hand stitch it, it can look very uneven. However, you can hide seams without sewing too. There's a couple of ways I hide my seams. There's the sewing method I just talked about, and the cutting, which everyone should probably cut the little bit of excess they have, especially of doll clothing. Of human clothing doesn't affect as much unless they're in like an itchy spot. But for doll clothing, you work with small things. You need to minimize the amount of material used to lessen the bulk and make it look a little bit more realistic. I also, at times, fold out the seams like this, where you get the hem on either side, and then I actually scrape the fabric like this against the corner of my desk. This does not work for all kinds of fabric, okay? This is if you're in a little bit of a rush and need to flatten out, let's say, a cotton fabric. A cotton or linen or anything that's a little bit more sturdy, like the kind of fabrics that are in pillow covers and stuff like that. These more sturdy fabrics react very well to a little bit of tension and just dragging them a little bit over a corner. This can flatten things out. However, this can stress the seams, and with cotton fabrics and similar woven fabrics, I always recommend that you don't cut too much of the seam allowance, simply because those fabrics can rip up. However, I do most of the time not hem, like pre-hem. I don't zigzag along the corners of all my cotton pieces. This is because I trust in the straight seams I do, and I know roughly how much of a seam allowance I can use on like certain clothing. I do use a zigzag at times on my cotton fabrics, but I prefer to keep it very simple and clean with straight seams. This makes a little less bulk, and it gives a slightly more realistic look where you don't see any zigzag seams showing or anything. It's really hard to explain some of my reasoning, because I've been sewing since I was like 8, and now I'm 22. So I've been sewing for quite a while, on and off when I was younger, but I hand stitched doll clothing like ever since I was like 12. and started with BAD clothing a couple of years ago, and I've been working with that ever since. We can get very, very cute and easy results. I'm gonna show you a couple of my stitching techniques while I finish up these pants. And I'm also most likely gonna show you when I trim a little bit of excess fabric on finished garments to show you how much harder it is to trim that than it is to trim something that's already laying flat. Please ignore my carefully bitten nails. I bite my nails. Don't judge me, we all have weird habits. Anyway, I don't always needle or pin my things in place. That adds a little bit of bulk that can make the seams uneven. If you don't trust yourself, use pins, pin things in place, and don't worry about it. However, to me, pins are used to help line certain things up, or when I do ruffles. However, just a straight seam like this, I carefully just place the items in place, and I hold the edge where it's supposed to be and up, and it turns out pretty much straight. If you're using a sewing machine or hand stitching, always remember to start and finish by going back and forth a little bit, because otherwise the seam is just going to unravel itself. Now we have this seam with quite a bit of bulk in certain areas, and we're gonna solve the bulk issue on these pants. There's the way of trimming off certain bulk by just cutting it off. On these straight pants, depending on the color of thread you use, it's a bit hard to see. So I can't really show you super well, but you can see the line where the seam is. And I'm gonna cut not too much because I'm gonna stitch these as well, but I cut a thin bit away so that I leave a bit less bulk, which will end up with less bulk in general. And then I am going to show you exactly how I line up to stitch this part. I am very sorry for all the random camera angles I'm gonna give you here, but now I know this is the front of the pants, right here. So when I fold the seam over, it's gonna be in that direction, because I want the seam on the front side of the pants. I can now notice that I cut a little bit too much of the excess fabric for this kind of seam to do its job correctly. But I'm still gonna do the seam because of symmetry, and I like how it looks. Now it's done, and it looks just like the other seam did. And on this side we have a really cute additional seam that gives these pants a little bit more life. So getting back to trimming, we have this shirt, but I turned it inside out, and there's quite a bit of bulk that I'm not gonna stitch down, and that's just gonna mean I will cut carefully, very carefully, because I don't want to have to remake the seam or redo the whole garment because I cut a little bit too close to the seam. I've done this mistake before, and I'm trying to help you not to do the same thing, because I've ruined too many items by rushing it. There's not that much bulk along the bottom edges. However, there is some bulk because I have a little bit of a ruffle on the top. And that's also going to get carefully trimmed to a more reasonable size that's easier to hide. I'm gonna repeat this process on the other side as well. On this side it's not as much, and it's a little bit more bunched up, which makes it harder to cut and harder to handle when I try to cut these. Then I am gonna go down to corners and I am going to snip off a very small part of it right there, and that makes the side a lot less bulky. It can affect the result of the garment depending on where you cut, what kind of fabric it is, and all of those factors. But I do at times cut off a little bit of the excess from where I fold in the edges in the back or in the bottoms, because it does add a lot of bulk to the garment, and if you want a garment that looks good from behind as well as from the front, you do have to take notice of where there's additional bulk that doesn't have to be there. There's of course again the ironing method, where you lay the seam out flat, you lay any seam out just flat as a pancake, and you iron it flat. You can either have it flat by having it flat like so, where you just fold it out, or you can have it flat to one side. If you're doing this, I recommend having the seams facing the same thing. So if there's, let's say, these side seams, I recommend folding in both towards the front or both towards the back, so it's no weird asymmetry, because the amount of bulk the seam gives can make, let's say, a female chest look uneven. And depending on your doll and aesthetic, that might not be what you want. I hope this has helped you a little bit, and I hope that I can do a little bit more of these sometime. I'm not used to making videos, so please be nice. It's been a long time since I recorded myself doing things, and since I tried to explain something I'm doing. So I really hope this was of any help, and remember to check out my shop, Viccylove Studios, on Etsy, and stay lovely or something. I don't know what to say, but yeah,